Today I'm gonna show the theory in the classical defense of the Ruy Lopez. So the Ruy Lopez starts after the moves 1 e4, 1 e5 controlling the center, knight to f3 attacking the e5 pawn and pressuring the d4 square as well, and knight to c6 defending the e5 pawn, and after white plays the move bishop to b5. This is known as the Ruy Lopez, and of course with this move white is kinda threatening to take on c6 and then maybe to take on e5 or to have the control over the center. So now black has some choices. He can play either a6, this is the main line, knight to f6 is the sideline with the Berlin defense, maybe even d6 or knight to e7, but today we're going to be looking at the move bishop to c5 in this position, which is known as the classical defense. So with this move bishop to c5, black is putting this bishop on this diagonal, and after white will castle, the f2 pawn will be pinned to the king, and black is simply trying to develop his king side and then to castle. So of course bishop to c5 is very logical move, just developing, and this c5 square for the bishop is very natural, and of course it might get attacked after white plays this crucial plan c3 and pawn to d4. So after bishop to c5, now white has two choices. He can either castle or to play the main line, which is to play the move pawn to c3. Of course, the idea being pawn to c3, preparing the move pawn to d4 in the future. So as I mentioned, the move castles is sideline and the move pawn to c3 is the main line. So we're firstly going to take a look at the move castles here. So after white castles, black plays this very natural move knight to d4. This is a idea in the Ruy Lopez to simply trade off these two knights and then have some central pressure. Of course, this pawn on e5 will stay here, and after knight takes d4, black simply takes back with the bishop, of course, and black still has this pawn on e5. So after bishop takes d4, the main line continue pawn to c3, of course, attacking the bishop and trying to play the move pawn to d4, which is a crucial plan in the Ruy Lopez for white, of course. And after black plays the move bishop to b6, of course it is better to retreat to b6 rather to c5 in this position, of course, because d4 after bishop to c5, d4 would attack bishop once again. So bishop to b6 is the best move, and after white plays this move pawn to d4, his whole idea is to have big strong center, of course. After the move pawn to d4, now the best move and crucial move for black is to play the move pawn to c6. Of course, black would love to play the move pawn to d6 here, defending the e5 pawn, but of course the pawn is pinned, so the move pawn to c6 here is very crucial, and after bishop to a4, now black gets to play this move pawn to d6. Of course, the pawn is no longer pinned to the king, and pawn to d6 is simply defending black's position. So after knight to a3, this is the main line. Of course, white is trying to play the move knight to c5, pressuring the bishop and pressuring the e5 pawn. So knight to a3 is very logical move, and of course it's better to play the move knight to a3 than to play knight to d2, because this bishop wants to have open diagonal, and of course knight to a3, maybe the knight will go to c2 back. So after knight to a3, knight f6 is the main line, and after bishop to g5, here you can see why it is important to play knight to a3 rather knight to d2, pinning this knight, and after the move h6, we simply take the knight. Of course, bishop to h4 would lead to this loss of a pawn, and of course after d takes e5, now black takes this bishop. So after the move h6 here, we have to take this knight, of course, with the move bishop takes f6, and after queen takes f6, now you can see that we play the move d5. Of course, pawn cannot take because of this bishop, and of course the only move that is good in the position is to play bishop to d7, unpinning and of course defending the attacked c6 pawn, and after knight to c4, putting pressure on the bishop and on the e5 pawn, black simply plays the move bishop to c7, and after the exchange of pawns, now black now white plays the move queen to d3, just solidifying whole position, defending the e4 pawn, and connecting the rooks. Of course, this rook will probably join the e file, or will play the move f4 in the future, opening up the f file. And of course, after black castles here, we play the move rook a to d1, putting some pressure on the d6 pawn. And I think white is slightly better here, but I think black is fine and black has equalized in my opinion. So this variation after bishop to c5 to just castle, I think is not the best in the position. I think the best move and the most challenging move for black to face is the move pawn to c3, trying to play pawn to d4, just striking in the center. So after pawn to c3, now black has two choices, either to play the normal game with the move knight to f6, or to play the very aggressive move pawn to f5 in this position. This is known as the Cordell Gambit. As you might imagine, it is very similar to the Schliemann Gambit or Rajanish Gambit, and you can check this video out. I made it on the theory on the Schliemann Gambit. But after f5, as you might imagine, taking the pawn is big mistake, because now black gets to play this e4 move and this knight is misplaced. Black will play d6 and will win this pawn back and will have much bigger control over the center. So after f5, the best move in the position for white is not to take the pawn, but to rather play the move pawn to d4, striking in the center. And of course now the only move for black is to take the e4 pawn. But now we don't take this pawn, allowing the trade of knights, but now we play the move bishop takes c6. This is crucial move in this variation, because after black were to take on f3, we'll take back with the bishop and would have amazing position. So after the move bishop takes c6 here, black has to take the bishop. Of course, taking with the d pawn is much more logical, opening up this diagonal for the bishop. So after d takes c6, the best move, of course, in the position for white is to simply take the pawn, and after bishop to d6, now you can see that this diagonal to the king is open, and after queen to h5, this is very annoying check to face, and after the move pawn to g6, of course the only move in the position. Now if you are white, you can be excited because of this sacrifice, but it cannot work in this position, because of course the idea being after knight takes g6 you cannot take back because the rook is hanging down. But after knight takes g6, now black has this intermezzo move, knight to f6 attacking the queen, and this position is simply lost for white. Of course, maybe he can get away with some sacrifice of the knight, but still black has much better, if not winning position after knight takes g6 here. And of course, the best move after queen to h5, excuse me, after g6 here is to simply play queen to e2, attacking the pawn, and after bishop to f5, the best move for white now is to play bishop to f4, just gaining, excuse me, bishop to f4, not bishop to e3, just gaining some control over the e5 square, of course. And as you can see, I think white has much better position. He has this very annoying knight on e5, although black has the two bishops, the bishop pair, but of course the position is not open, so this knight is much better piece than these two bishops combined. So after bishop to f4, knight to f6, knight to d2, this is the mainline theory in this position. Of course, black has some chances as well. He will castle, and this rook will have the semi-open f-file to attack, but I think because of this knight, black is simply slightly worse, and I think white has an amazing position, amazing practical position. Maybe he will even castle long and have some attack over on the king side. Of course, this is superficial, but of course I think white has better position. So after the move pawn to c3, now we just looked at the move pawn to f5, the Cordell Gambit. I think this is a good weapon if you are black. This might surprise some people, but if you are classical player, after c3 you should definitely play the move knight to f6, just solidifying the position. Of course you are putting pressure on the e4 pawn, and this is the studied main line. And after knight to f6 there are not many options. White simply plays the move pawn to d4, striking in the center, attacking the bishop on c5. And after bishop to b6, of course taking the pawn is not good, because now white gets the 2 pawns in the center. Of course he will push those pawns and will simply have much better position. So after d4, the only good move for black is to simply play the move bishop to b6, and after both sides castles, this is the main position of the classical defense to the Ruy Lopez. And after bishop to g5, h6, bishop to a4, now you can see that there is no same trick as before. g5 in this position cannot work, because this pawn on e4 is hanging as well, and I think this knight is much better than this knight. It has some pressure on black's position, of course, and this knight will simply get kicked away. And of course d6 is playable, but we will place knight to f3, and these 2 pawns are simply overextended here on the king side. So after bishop to g5, you should remember in the main line, after h6, you must not take the f6 pawn, you must play the move bishop to h4, because there is no trick with the move pawn to g5 here. So after bishop to h4, the best move in the position for black, the theory goes pawn to d6, just solidifying his position. Of course there is no pin to this knight, because king has already castled, so there are not any tactics with takes with this hanging e5 pawn, because king has already castled, as I mentioned. So after d6, the best move in the position for white is simply to solidify his position with the move queen to d3, putting some pressure on the key squares on the board. And of course queen to d3, maybe preparing some bishop a4 and bishop c2 idea of this checkmating attack. Of course there is no way to open this diagonal up for now, but maybe you will take or play d5, and this pawn might disappear from the board. And this is some middle game tips for you if you are white in this position. So of course if you are black, this position is fine for you, but you will have some struggles to equalize the game. So after queen to d3, the theory goes queen to e7, and this is the mainline theory, knight b to d2. And now if you are black, you should remember this maneuver. The best move in the position is to play knight to b8, of course trying to play knight to d7 back, and this is simply putting some pressure on the c5 square when the knight reaches d7, of course defending the e5 pawn, over protecting the e5 pawn if we are exact. And this is similar to the Breyer defense in the closed Ruy Lopez, of course. Maybe you know this maneuver before. Knight to b8 in the Ruy Lopez is not as bad as you might think. So after knight to b8, the move rook f to e1 should be played, and after c6 we play the move bishop a4. Of course c6 has to be played, because after knight to d7 maybe white would take the knight, and so the move pawn to c6 is the best. And after bishop to a4, now black plays the move knight b to d7, of course protecting this e5 pawn, and maybe trying to play c5 in the future. And of course bishop to c7 will be played anyway. So after knight to c4, putting pressure both on the bishop and on the e5 pawn. Now you can see that after bishop to c7, it's kind of important that this knight is not longer on c6, but it is on d7, of course overprotecting this very important stronghold on e5. And after knight to e3, just maneuvering the knight as well. And after a rook to e8, this is kind of the end of the theory, the end of known theory. And of course you can see that white has control over the f5 square and will maybe put a knight there. And of course there is still some central tension over on d4 and e5 squares. And of course black will play the move probably b5 sometimes, or even a6 and then b5, and maybe putting this bishop on this long diagonal, and maybe trying to play the move pawn to c5. So this position is of course good for both sides. If you know what you are doing, you should be better if you are white, and if you are black, you should surprise some of the opponents with this classical defense, because this is not as popular as some other defenses to the Ruy Lopez. So of course white will play rook to d1, rook a to d1, and maybe we'll open up the position and have some tactics going on the d file. But of course after bishop to c5, you should expect to have a real serious game of ideas, game of plans. And if you are black, you should play bishop to c5 if you are trying to surprise your opponent. And if you are white, you should know the theory, you should know that you are slightly better out of the opening and you will be fine in the game. Of course, knowing the ideas is very good for both sides, and if you study the classical defense with both colors, you should be fine in the game. So if you like the video, make sure to subscribe to follow more such content, and see you guys in another video.